Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode on liberation theology. The focus of this episode is to just give a very basic overview of the development of liberation theology in the 20th century. So we've looked at Karl Barth and Rudolf Bultmann and talked about how their theology really takes shape in the 20th century in the context of World War I and World War II, and really doing theology after the death of God, after Friedrich Nietzsche. And so liberation theology begins to really take root and develop in the Roman Catholic Church. And I'm going to focus on a particular book written by Gustavo Gutierrez, A Theology of Liberation, which really becomes, I would say, the standard text of thinking about liberation theology. Now, it's important to recognize that people in this field would normally say to me, it's not liberation theology, it's liberation theologies. In other words, there are various theological perspectives that arise from this work. And so we're specifically looking at what happens in Latin America, Gustavo Gutierrez, but recognizing that there are liberation theologies that develop out of this perspective. So what Gutierrez does is he focuses on kind of thinking about the relationship between the Catholic Church, colonialism, and the relationship between structures of power, institutions, and the poor. And so when you look at Western society, when you look at colonization in Central America and South America, what you find is that most of the wealth and power get concentrated within a very, very few people up at the top, and the remaining people become poor. What they thought was that the Roman Catholic Church was undergirding the structures as they existed. They weren't challenging the structures, and I think some would say that they weren't also trying to support the structures. By spiritualizing faith and Christianity, there was a sense in which Christianity wasn't touching the lived experience of the poor living in Latin America. And so in his book, Theology of Liberation, he talks about the task of theology. And what he says is when you look at classical theology, a lot of the stuff that we've been exploring through these episodes, so think about Augustine, think about Thomas Aquinas, even think about Barth. There's a sense in which theology wants to go from God and focus on God and then work its way down. And so classical theology was about this higher reality, trying to provide truth about God and the world, but wasn't necessarily as involved in looking at the context in which people were living. And so what Gutierrez wants to do is say that theology has to become critical reflection, that it can't bracket out the lived experiences of people. Now, what that does, so we have talked a little bit about Schleiermacher and the progressive theology and liberal theology, which did talk about wanting to start with the experiences of humanity and then begin to talk about God in that way. But what it was doing was privileging a particular cultural expression and saying, all right, how does God speak through this particular cultural expression? What liberation theology is doing is saying, look at the experience of the poor as they live within colonization, as they live within these structures, as they are oppressed. What does theology have to say to this? How does God speak to this experience? So when Gutierrez wants to talk about beginning with human experience and beginning with the life of the church in the world, he's not saying we're going to start from a privileged place and then kind of, make God fit our categories, but saying maybe what theology needs to do is speak into the suffering and the oppression of people. And maybe the point of theology and the church and faith is to bring transformation, not just to the spiritual side, but also to the physical side, to the cultural side, to the social side. And so it's important to recognize the influences here, that there is and I want to be very, very careful with this. I am not saying that Gutierrez is Marxist or that liberation theology is Marxist. What Marx does, and I think what Marx does well, is explore the relationship between ideas and action. And a lot of times we think if we start with the right ideas, it will lead to right action. And what Marx does is flips that over. Oftentimes, the ideas we cultivate are there to support a way of life and to support our action. And so Marxism becomes a way of thinking about critical critique of culture. And that was influential in liberation theology. But it's also, and I want to make this clear, it is not starting with Marxism. It's starting with the revelation of God in the Exodus, for example, seeing the oppression of the people of Israel, in Jesus being amongst the poor and the marginalized, in the book of Acts, caring for the poor and the widows and so on. And what it is, it's also eschatologically minded. In other words, it's a recognition that the breaking in of God in Jesus Christ is about liberation from sin. And sin is not just personal. Sin is also societal. It is institutional. And so we need to hold those things together. This is what Gutierrez and this is what liberation theology is really wanting to emphasize. So what he talks about is theology as critical reflection or orthopraxis. Begin with the experience of the church to bring hope and transformation and liberation. And he also wants then to bring in this idea of pastoral care, that too often theological reflection becomes about abstraction. We sit around and we think about ideas about God, and as long as we make sure people have the right ideas, we just kind of go on and live our lives. And what Gutierrez is arguing is that reflection about who God is has to be bound up with the care of our neighbor and the material conditions, the lived experience in which we live. And so as we think about liberation, one of the tasks of the church is to provide a prophetic denunciation of the status quo. It is to recognize when the way things are oppressive and when they are causing certain people harm, and how often religion can intentionally or unintentionally be used to simply undergird these practices without thinking. So the idea that, hey, life might be bad for you now, but just believe in God and believe in Jesus. When you die, you'll go to heaven and things will be great. You'll have your reward in heaven. And that becomes used as a way to try to keep people in their place and to not ask questions and to not seek change and transformation. And what Gutierrez is arguing is theological reflection has to address the lived experiences of the poor and the oppressed. And he would argue it must become the church of the poor. Now, one of the things that he emphasizes in liberation theology is that the goal of all of this is the new humanity, the restoration of relationship between God and humanity, but also the restoration of the relationship between our neighbor, with our neighbor. And this includes and gets expanded by others to include the ecological world. That the devastation that has been unleashed in the name of capitalism and industrialization has wreaked havoc on people, on communities, on the poor, but also on creation itself. And so what liberation theology wants to do is broaden out how we understand sin and salvation and redemption, and see that the work of Christ on the cross is bringing a reconciliation for all of creation. Now, from a biblical perspective, what we can see here is that the creation account can be read in a kind of salvific way, that God brings order from chaos. God creates a space in which people and creation can live in peace and harmony. We can find political liberation in the Exodus, that God sees the misery of his people and comes to lead them out of the oppression of Pharaoh. Sin in this context also gets interpreted as alienation, how we become alienated from God. And then in that alienation from God, we alienate ourselves from one another. We oppress one another. We objectify one another, and we objectify the created world. And the whole point of God becoming human in Jesus Christ is to come and bring reconciliation, reconciling us to God, reconciling us to our neighbor and to the created world. And this is the promise of resurrection, which is the promise of new life, that in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there's a new way of living, a new way of being human that is unleashed in the world, and that the church must testify to this new way of living. When we talk about the new humanity, it's important that we recognize we're not talking about this in the context of humanism, but maybe a Christian humanism, that in Jesus Christ, in the resurrection, we see the new humanity. So when we talk about the new humanity, what we're doing is talking about humanity reconciled to God, participating in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which brings about a reconciliation from this alienation. Now, the other thing that Gutierrez wants to emphasize is a concrete spirituality. That too often spirituality gets projected into this abstraction, as if the point of Christian spirituality is to love some abstract God, hope for some abstract heaven. Our prayers are about, personal salvation and so on. And what Gutierrez wants to do is broaden it out to say, no, this spirituality is about concreteness. It's about every human being living as a temple of God. It's about the love of God expressed in our love for neighbor, and that true spirituality seeks liberation. It seeks a conversion towards the poor and the broken and the oppressed, but also a conversion to a way of life in which we see things as grace and gift. I'm reminded of the text in Deuteronomy where, in talking about the tithing, the whole point is, all right, give your 10% to the priests and the Levites, but then it goes on and it says, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted. In other words, use the rest of your wealth in a way that cares for your neighbor and cares for the poor. It's not that Gutierrez is saying that is the kingdom of God or that we're bringing some kind of salvation. But what he does see again is that this is a sign of justice, that justice in the world is a sign that points to the kingdom of God that is coming into this world, but that it has to begin to take concrete action and a concrete expression in the way we organize our lives and the way we love our neighbors. And so what it's trying to do is say, look, theology for too long wanted to live in this abstraction. And now we must recognize that true theological reflection has to take place within the concreteness of our humanity and our relationships and the issues that we wrestle with. And so this is where liberation theology becomes liberation theologies. So Gutierrez is speaking about the Latin American experience. We're going to talk about James Cone, who speaks about the African American experience. We can talk about the Native experience. We can go on and talk about the ways in which we oppress one another and how sometimes theology and religion can be used as a way to continue that oppression, to maintain the status quo. And Gutierrez in Liberation Theology is calling the church to a new expression. And in some way, what he says is that the church becomes a sign or sacrament of the salvation, that the church doesn't exist for itself, but for others. And he talks about how the task of the Christian community in the church is twofold. Number one, it is about denunciation. We have to say what's wrong. We have to call it wrong, and we have to stand up for those who are being oppressed and those who are struggling. But it is also annunciation, announcing the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the good news of the Gospels. That yes, spiritually we are saved in the sense that as an individual we are saved. And I don't think Gutierrez is trying to say we can't talk at all about the individual person, but it goes beyond that. So as we start thinking about what it means to be a human being, as we reflect upon things like neuroscience and other things that are saying more and more we are interconnected with one another, that our identity comes from outside of ourselves, what it's saying then is that sin and salvation are broader, and that we must now announce that there is a new way of life and that we need to live out that way of life in the world as a sign of God's work in Jesus Christ. And so for Gutierrez too, it's about engaging the realities of this world. This is the, where the two kingdoms vision that Luther had begun to say, I think can become oppressive. So if the spiritual world, if everything about spirituality and salvation and sin and all of that is in the spiritual side, and we go to church and we receive the word and the sacraments, and that's where we're justified. Now, Luther did say, go out and love your neighbor, and that we should live that out in the temporal side. But Luther was also socially conservative and did not want radical transformation of that social side. But what can eventually develop is a justification of why the world is the way it is, why there is the inequity of income, or why there's gender inequity, or why racism exists, or why all of these things are there. There's a way in which the two kingdoms theory becomes a way of not justifying non-involvement. Well, this isn't what Christianity is about. It is about preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ to save sinners. It's not about engaging in these social and cultural issues. And Gutierrez and others are wanting to say, no, it is about all of it. And how do we as a Christian community live out our faith in such a way that we become signs of God's transformation and change? So that is just a very, very brief overview of Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theology. This works its way out now in things like Black theology, feminist theology, queer theology. There are all kinds of them that break open and are asking questions about how theology historically has been done to maintain a status quo. And is there a way now of doing theology in conversation or in context that can help bring about change and transformation? Not that we're saving people or saving things, but that we become signs of the change and transformation that God is bringing in the person of Jesus Christ.